What's going on, YouTube? We're talking Auburn football, and in the deep south where college football is king, and on the plains of Auburn, the battle cry is War Eagle. Once again, it's K2 to go for Vernon Speaks Sports. We're talking mad football here in the month of May. Matter of fact, May is almost over. We're getting dangerously close to the Advocare Classic, where Auburn will be taking on Pac-12 hopeful Oregon. Now, fearless and true gang, let's go ahead and get this comment section active. If you are new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe to Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn. We get this comment section very active. As a matter of fact, I get a lot of information out of the comment section. Stumbled upon a little bit of commentary yesterday from what appeared to be an Oregon / Pac-12 enthusiast, and it was a little vulgar, but went on to say, you know, we don't want to hear about this SEC being the #1 conference crap and, you know, blah, blah, blah. Now, I do get it. I do know that it gets old, the song and dance of the SEC being the best conference, and some people actually have a mindless opinion as it relates to the SEC and somewhat biased. But then when you really dissect the numbers from 2018, you know, you can state a pretty nice case that the SEC, if not the best conference, very, very productive. You know, you talk about the SEC East having 3 teams that were 10 wins or more. The SEC West having 2. Now, here's the kicker about this. When you look at all the other Power 5 conferences, including the Big 12, the Pac-12, the ACC, you talk about only having 2 10-win teams in each of those conferences. And usually they come out of the champion sub-conference. So that means, you know, let's just say even the Pac-12 on last year. Washington actually lost 2 games last year, and of those 2 games was a loss in a neutral site to an 8-5 Auburn team last year. Also, when you look at the other side, the South, in the Pac-12, even some of the middle tier teams in the SEC would have been very competitive in making a run to win the Pac-12 South, meaning that you have several teams out of the SEC that could have competed in the Pac-12 for the Pac-12 champions from the South end. Also, I mean, some of your 10-win teams could have made a push in the Pac-12 even for the North, okay? But that's neither here nor there. Just a few stats to kind of help some of our other conferences out to see why the SEC, at least from last year's standpoint and years before, highly productive. Now, when we talk about the Auburn Tigers coming into the 2019 season, we're really interested to know how successful this team can actually be. One factor you got to look at is during Gus Malzahn's era, for whatever reason, in odd number years, he seems to be the most successful. Now, one of the biggest factors in all of that is the fact that in odd number years, he has the privilege of playing Georgia and Alabama, 2 of his biggest rivals, 2 of Auburn's biggest rivals, also 2 of the most highly recruiting universities in the nation. He has the privilege of having those teams at home. And that has boded very well for Auburn, except for in 2015. And we all remember the debacle of 2015. But in 2013, of course, you had the prayer at Jordan Hare and also the kick 6. And then in 2017, pretty dominant over Georgia and Alabama in those years. So that's something that could be, or that will be, a factor going into the 2019 season. Because honestly, when you look at most of the preseason footage or preseason coverage of Auburn Tigers, most of your analysts are not going to project Auburn to beat Alabama or Georgia. Nobody's even expecting them to split. But with that actually being home games for Auburn this year, that could be a huge factor. Auburn plays very well against these teams when they play in Jordan Hare Stadium for obvious reasons. All right, the next thing we want to look at is the experience that Auburn has coming back. When you look at all of the successful seasons that Auburn has had, even since 2004, Auburn has had 10 or more starters from the previous year returning. You look at the Auburn Tigers with Boobie Whitlow coming back. Also, the entire offensive line will be returning. Seth Williams at receiver will be coming back. Sean Shivers is coming back. Also, Anthony Swartz is coming back. Sal Cannella as well. The only factor on offense is you're going to have a brand new quarterback, but for all intents and purposes, going to be a very skilled quarterback who will be able to run, at least in some variation, the run-pass option that Gus Malzahn likes to run, and I think it will be very effective. Now, also, in addition to the experience that's coming back, a very costly factor for the Auburn Tigers in 2016 and 17 was the depth in skill position, in very, very important skill position. In 2016, Auburn was making one of the best runs in the nation. The outcome, if the job would have been finished, would have been Auburn having the luxury of being the first two-loss team potentially to make it to the college football playoffs. Auburn goes into the Vanderbilt game with Shaun White injured and John Franklin III, the starting quarterback. Okay. Also in that particular football game, Cameron Petway was one of the hottest running backs in the country at that time. Even with the eventual injury, wound up leading the SEC in rushing that year. Cameron Petway goes down in the Vanderbilt game with a thigh injury. It was either a thigh injury or a hamstring injury, but either way, after that particular injury, he really wasn't productive anymore on a high level for the Auburn Tigers. But when you look at those two injuries, there were really no viable replacements for the Auburn Tigers. And guess what? After those two guys get injured, the season is pretty much a wrap. Okay, Auburn began a downward spiral, losing to Georgia in 2016, Alabama, and eventually in their bowl game against Oklahoma. You fast forward to 2017, Auburn again, one of the hottest teams in the country, looking at the prospect of potentially being a two-loss team, making it into the college football playoff. Here we are again. Auburn actually had Kerryon Johnson, who took over midway through the midway point of the season, having a spectacular stretch. However, in the game against Alabama, where Auburn won 26-14, headed to the SEC championship, Kerryon Johnson basically goes down with a presumed shoulder injury. Now, going into the SEC championship game, Auburn just didn't have or didn't trust the options that it had in Cam Martin and, say, Devin Barrett, because Kerryon Johnson still was the go-to guy in that game and just not near as effective as he had been weeks prior. Proved to be very costly in that particular game. Auburn was actually still in that SEC championship game against Georgia midway through the third quarter. Then Kerryon Johnson uncharacteristically fumbles the football. Georgia actually blocks a field goal, and when Georgia blocked that field goal from Auburn, I knew the momentum at that point. That was the point where the momentum started to shift in that game. Georgia eventually won that game 28-7 on their way. Georgia on their way to a college football playoff berth, and eventually the runner-up in the college football national championship, losing to Alabama in overtime. But what we would like to think is, because of recruiting efforts, Auburn will be at least quality deep at the running back position. When you look at DJ Williams, Boobie Whitlow, Sean Shivers, and Mark Anthony Richards will be coming on this particular fall, and Auburn should have a relative positive amount of depth at the running back position going into 2019. Also, when you look at the quarterback position, Malik Willis has transferred, so that will take away from the superior depth that Auburn would have had at quarterback. However, you're talking about Bo Nix and Joey Gatewood and Cord Sandberg, all appearing to be reliable options at the quarterback position going into this fall. Now, another thing that I think will be a great factor for the Auburn Tigers. Now, we talk about Auburn having a very tough schedule, but when I really looked at this, that's kind of sort of speculation at this point. Now, don't get me wrong. I think a lot of these teams are going to be very good this year, but I think we're kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit when we talk about recruiting classes, because just because you have a top 5 recruiting class does not make up for all the years you didn't. So we look at Oregon coming into the first game of the season. Oregon with a 7-6 win over Michigan State in the bowl game that they participated in. I want to say not the Fiesta Bowl, but the PlayStation Bowl, something like that. But either way, Oregon has had a great recruiting class this year, ranked number 7 in the country, but that doesn't necessarily translate to superiority. I think going into this game, Auburn is, in a pretty good position, experience-wise, skill position-wise. I think this could be a very successful game for the Auburn Tigers. And it's not a game that, when you look at it, you should be like, oh, Auburn has this just brutal schedule, which I talked about a few weeks ago. But when I really took an educated look at it, the schedule may not be as brutal as we may think. Because, Auburn has a game against Oregon. Then the games against Kent State and Tulane to count as a tune-up right before SEC play. Also having some nice open dates in the middle of the season, including, for the first time that I can remember, an open date between LSU and Georgia. So, Auburn has some gaps in the season to where they can really make this schedule work for them, okay? Also, late in the season, having the game against Samford sandwiched in between Georgia and Alabama. So the schedule is set up pretty nicely to where Auburn should be able to successfully navigate to potentially win 10 games, at least 10 games this year. Now, also, you got to look at the fact that Auburn has to play Texas A&M, Florida, and LSU on the road. But Auburn brings a wealth of talent and experience back to where these guys, they're experienced, they're accustomed to playing in these high-level games on the road. They're accustomed to playing in neutral sites against non-conference opponents. So all of those things can be huge factors for the Auburn Tigers going into the 2019 season. The last thing, offensive production. Under the Gus Malzahn era, when Gus Malzahn is calling plays, very productive offensively. You're talking great time of possession, great yards running, and also very productive scoreboard-wise. That will be a huge factor because Auburn took a huge step back in 2018 from an offensive standpoint. So, with all of those in mind, I think Auburn is set up to have a potentially successful season. I'm looking at 10 wins or more that Auburn can win, taking advantage of opportunity. Once again, it's K-Stu to go for Vernon Speaks Sports. Let me know your opinion on this as to whether you think Auburn can win 10 games this year, or what are some of your factors as to how that can happen. Go ahead and leave your comments in the comment section. Also, subscribe to Vernon Speaks Auburn. You all have an incredible day. War Eagle.